Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this beautiful fall day. I've had the opportunity recently to ride around the state, and even in the lower parts of the state, the leaves are changing, and it's just a wonderful time of year. And I thank you all for taking time to join us today, taking your valuable time to join us today to talk about legislative issues. And so, again, I want to thank you for joining SCSBA for our annual legislative preview webinar. I am Scott Price. I'm the Executive Director for the South Carolina School Boards Association. Also helping us today, but behind the scenes, are Rod Nixon, who was our IT guy and coordinates all our technology needs, Natalie Artis, who provides outstanding support to our governmental relations and communications team, Becky Bean, who heads up our communications and marketing for the association, and Debbie Elmore, who is the Director of Governmental Relations for the association. We're pleased to offer this annual webinar as a unique learning opportunity for you, our valued members. During the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to discuss education issues that will likely be in front of the General Assembly in 2022. And we're heading into an interesting year. It's an election year, and we also have redistricting on the front burner. So it's who knows where that can take us. But the basics behind this webinar, we've been doing it for a couple of years now, are simple. We're sharing with you all information on key education issues so that you can discuss them together with members of your board and members of your legislative delegation between now and January, before lawmakers return to Columbia for the second year of the two-year session. And that'll be in January when they return. We encourage you to share and discuss these issues with staff, parents, and community leaders in your districts. We invite you during the webinar to submit any questions or comments by typing them into the chat box on the bottom of your screen, and I believe that would be available to everybody, and everybody will be able to see those chats questions. So bear that in mind as you're typing a comment or chat, that other people will be able to see that. And please don't hesitate to submit your questions or comments at any point during the webinar, or even after the webinar. If something occurs to you that we need to know about, please let us know, because we certainly appreciate hearing from you all, not only today, but throughout the legislative process and the year. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a lot of ground to cover today, and I'm going to now at this point turn it over to Debbie Elmore, our Director of Governmental Relations for the SCSBA. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Scott, and welcome everyone for joining. Welcome for joining us for the webinar. Scott mentioned. This year, we're going to do something a little different with this webinar than we've done in the past, and that's primarily because we heard from you, our members, about, in addition to hearing those things that will likely come up in the legislature through what? Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm supposed to share my screen. I apologize. So here it is, right here, right? Share this. Okay. Thank you, Becky, for keeping me straight. Okay. There's that work. Can you see that? Okay. But in addition to sharing with you those issues that we are likely to see in, oh gosh, 2022, that just seems unreal. 2022, just time flies. But in 2022, we also wanted to talk about those things that we want to be advocating for. And one of the other things that we did differently this year is, as many of you know or may not know, every fall we hold regional meetings around the state. And this past September and October, we held 4 regional meetings around the state. And it was a great time to see so many of you, even who are participating in the webinar, to attend these. And we use these meetings to focus on talking about the legislation, the monumental legislation that passed last year's calendar year, but in this year, this past legislative session, that really revised the education accountability system, and also includes that provision that dissolves locally elected school boards in districts that have been declared to be in a state of education emergency, and those districts where the state takes over the management of those districts. So in response to that, we wanted to use the regional meetings to find out from our membership what they believe, what you believe would be issues that would help strengthen school board governance to respond to this legislation. If they are going to hold school boards accountable to a state standard that no other elected body in the state is held to, then what would make you stronger? What would help you as school boards? And we started with the existing legislative resolutions that you vote on annually. And we pulled those resolutions that either directly or indirectly impacted local school boards. Because as you know, we have probably a list of 30 legislative resolutions, and only pulled those as a starting point, and had had the meeting participants to go through them after reviewing the new law, go through them and discuss those. And so that was a major portion of that. And so what we'd like to do now is to kind of share those top legislative issues that boards identified. And for those of you who participated in the meeting, you all actually voted them in your individual meetings and didn't really know kind of what everybody else said. So I'm going to share those with you, mainly to share with you is those things that we want to advocate for. These are things that we want to see bills filed in the legislature in 2022. We want to be advocating for something. So we appreciate the participants this year in those meetings. And I will tell you, it was pretty consistent. I would say that the issues that rose to the top were top issues in each of the 4 meetings. So that was kind of unique, I would say, because typically, you might see one region really hold other certain resolutions up higher than in other areas. So, but it was pretty consistent no matter where we went. And so I want to share those with you again for those issues that we want to propose to advocate for passage beginning in 2022. As you know, legislation doesn't move fast. So, can't say that we would get all these passed, but at least these are some things that we want to advocate for. So the number one issue that just rose to the top in all of 4 regional meetings is in response to this law is that we want to see board training become a part of all of the technical assistance that's provided to school districts that have been rated as underachieving or underperforming. And that's the actual term in the law is underperforming, or those districts in chronically underperforming. And at that point, of course, if you're chronically underperforming, then that is the point at which the state could recommend a takeover. And that is, of course, when the boards in those districts would be dissolved. So our members told us that that should be priority. In the law currently, it says that when a district is rated as underperforming, that a diagnostic review is conducted of the district. And typically under that diagnostic review, they're looking at things like a curriculum, teachers, administrators, primarily the operations of the school district. There is a new provision in the law that does say that the State Department will start monitoring school boards for efficiency and effectiveness, but that's not really defined, and it's only to monitor. Nowhere in the law does it say that board training is provided. So what we heard from our members is that, okay, you're going to pass this law that's going to hold us to a high standard, then we need to incorporate board training. And that training needs to be conducted, begin to be conducted at the point that you become underperforming and not at the point when you take over a school district. So we are going to advocate this coming legislative session that we amend that law to say that as part of that diagnostic review, that a review also be conducted, that part of that review include the school board, and then to determine what type of training should be tailored to that board to help strengthen that board. As part of that, just as you're going to do when you do the diagnostic review and you find weaknesses in the curriculum, the department then establishes technical assistance to address that. So we want the same thing for the school boards. And so that's something that we would be advocating for. And I also want to point out too, just take a moment here, that you should have been, each of you should have been emailed a handout. And so if you look at the handout that we provided to you, you will see these 4 issues that I'm reviewing now, and kind of some talking points as well when you're advocating and when we are advocating for these issues. And so you can do that, and it starts on page 1 actually with that. So that was the first issue that ranked very high. Another one that ranked pretty high up there is fiscal autonomy. And the thought was that, according to the participants, was that if you're going to hold us to this high standard, but yet tie our hands when it comes to the ability to provide resources that we need, then elected boards should have that authority. And as we know, across our state, because of local state legislation, we have all kinds of levels of fiscal autonomy across the state for school boards. Some school boards, I think it's now 23 school boards, that have full autonomy. Some have to go to county councils for their millage. Some have to go to a referendum, and some have to go to a referendum once it reaches a certain point. So it's all across the board of how the finances are handled in each school district. And so we are going to be advocating then for a law that would allow for fiscal autonomy to occur for all elected boards. And there's 2 key points that I want to make about this particular issue. And that is that if you look at all of the recent school district consolidation bills that have passed recently, where they're consolidating primarily small rural districts into countywide districts, in every single one of those bills, there's 2 elements that are consistent. And that is that the consolidated district board will be elected, and that board will have fiscal autonomy. So I think that says something about the importance of fiscal autonomy, having that board have that ability to control those finances. The second key point that I would make about fiscal autonomy that I think we need to use when we talk to lawmakers about this issue is that keep in mind that under Act 388, school boards actually do not have full fiscal autonomy in terms of they can just raise as much taxes as they want to. That doesn't happen under Act 388 because there's a cap that local boards can raise the levy of taxes in any given year based on a formula within that law. So it's not like, these lawmakers could say, well, gosh, then they could just tax everybody. That doesn't occur. Yes.
And Debbie, I'd like to make a point on that.
Oh, look, you put Miss J on there.
What? Oh, good grief.
Somebody's unmuted. I'd like to make a point on that if I could, or 2 points actually. Because Act 388, the cap under Act 388 is not something that as much as we don't like that cap and never have, we're not advocating for that. So that's probably something I think helpful to share with your legislators when you're talking about fiscal autonomy.
That's right.
The other thing that I would like to do too is ask to specifically hear from you districts out there that do not have fiscal autonomy. Because as Debbie pointed out, there are a number of districts that do have fiscal autonomy in the state. And while we are perhaps looking at something statewide, perhaps we can also approach this at the local level too. In other words, while we're trying to push for something statewide, we can be working behind the scenes to perhaps get some local legislation filed that would benefit individual districts in terms of the ability to levy millage. So I would like to hear from the districts, either, not obviously today if you can, but to let us know, your interest in looking at something like that, because I think that's something that it needs to be a two-pronged effort in my opinion, where we're looking at something statewide, but also approaching it from the local side too, because I think we probably will have more success with that locally. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you. No, please chime in at any point on this. Those are excellent points. Okay. The other point that a big point that I would make about in regards to fiscal autonomy, again, this is in response to the new law, is that if boards are going to be held to such a high standard where they can actually be dissolved, then certainly they are charged in state statute of overseeing, approving the budget. So there is some oversight that the board has in terms of monitoring the implementation of those budgets. And so it becomes a question of then why would you want to tie our hands when it comes to revenue? So those are all good questions. I think we talked about these same things in our regional meetings, but I think those are the points that we would want to make in regards to fiscal autonomy. Also, again, just reminder that if you have a question, please type that in your chat box and we will be happy to answer those. I think we've got a couple, Natalie and Becky are actually monitoring the chat box, so she'll will stop us at any point to answer any of those. All right, so I'm going to move on then to the third issue. And this one is, again, it's an existing legislative resolution that we have and we've voted on, and that is that we would like for there to be either legislation, and I mean, Scott and I have talked about this. It may be something that we could ask the General Assembly. They have rules in the House and they have rules in the Senate. Maybe they just wouldn't require legislation. It might require a rule in each body, but this idea of filing local legislation that impacts school districts, that there's sometimes, believe it or not, there's times when a local law to change something within a school district, like to consolidate a school district or to change the way board members are elected or appointed within a district, that sometimes bills are filed and the school board has no knowledge of it. That just comes to a surprise of that when that legislation is filed. And so you all, the participants again in the regional meetings, you all have said that, this should not happen, that there should be some notification to local school boards that before a local bill is filed, that there be some discussion with that local board and actually some sort of a statement attached to that bill where it says that local boards were notified of this.
And I would just like to add to that too, Debbie, that local laws are something that sometimes they help you, sometimes they don't. Depends on the nature of the local bill, and sometimes we've been supportive of them and sometimes we haven't. The bottom line is for us is no legislative delegation should ever file a local bill that's going to impact on a school district without that school board knowing about it, period. And what we're trying to do is, and that's really kind of, I'll just go ahead and say it. That's really kind of the ball being in your court. From our standpoint, is you've got to have that kind of a relationship with your delegation members that they are not going to file a bill without you knowing about it. Be that as it may, it happens all the time. So one of the things that we would like to try and do is we've approached some of the members of the legislature about this, and maybe it ends up being a Senate rule or a House rule as opposed to something in statute. But we feel like that no bill should ever be filed without you all being cognizant of it. It's a fairness issue and it's a respect issue. And that's something that we're going to push for, but it's also something that you all as elected school boards need to demand from your delegation members. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to back up. I apologize. I'm going to back up to that last. I want to make one more point about the fiscal autonomy. And this is an important one. For those because we did talk about this in the regional meetings, and for those districts that do have fiscal autonomy, you have a role in advocating for the fiscal autonomy for those boards that do not. And I'm going to say this because a lot of times when we have an issue and you think, oh, it's not going to impact us, we don't have to really say anything. We're going to ask you to please advocate for this, because if you have fiscal autonomy and it works well for you, then you more than anybody can talk about why school boards need to have this, because how it benefits you and how that you are responsible as a board with this fiscal autonomy. So I wanted to come back up for a minute to just kind of point that out, because we think that's a key point, that, we're all in this together, and that those of you that have fiscal autonomy, and again, we need to hear from you. Lawmakers need to hear from you as well, and your lawmakers do, to be able to support that same opportunity for all of school boards that do not have it. So I just want to make that, I appreciate your indulgence here for just a second. All right, so we're going to move on to the final issue that just rose to the top from our regional meetings. And that is, which I will have to tell you, Scott, I was a little, I don't know. I mean, I agree with this resolution, but I was surprised that, this one was a top issue, because I didn't think it was too widespread, but most of the boards in every regional meeting, this came up. So it is the resolution.
I'm glad to hear that you agree with the resolution of your membership.
I know, really, thank you.
Yeah, that pleases me to hear that.
I know, but I didn't think it was widespread, but it is. That there should be a law to allow school boards, or to authorize school boards to levy impact fees, especially in districts that are fast growing. We know again, with Act 388, fast growing districts have difficulty in keeping up with that growth in terms of their local tax base under that cap of Act 388 and other provisions in that act. It's very difficult for them. So this one rose to the top, and it again is another issue in which boards are saying, quit tying our hands. We've got to have more tools, I guess, in the tool chest to be able to address issues specific to our districts. And if you're in a district that is seeing a lot of growth, it becomes very difficult. It becomes very difficult under our funding structure. So, that's just an option for boards to have in order to raise that revenue.
Debbie, we have a request here, an unusual request, but I think it's probably a good opportunity to hear from one of the, I believe, 2 school boards out there that actually have the ability to levy impact fees. So I'm going to ask Christy Spears from Fort Mill if she would join us and just talk about this just a little bit.
Hey, thanks. I've unmuted, so hopefully you guys can hear me. In reading this, I guess what I want to make sure is that we portray the current situation, because it is now, the law has been changed where school boards can implement impact fees. And in fact, we have in Fort Mill, and as you mentioned in here, we've been through some legal challenges. We're still fighting a couple of them, but I just want to make sure that if this is going to be a priority, which I'm all for, because obviously we need it and want to be able to continue, but I just want to make sure we have the current situation accurately captured as far as what we need the legislative change to.
Christy, what the statute currently allows is for county council to levy impact fees on behalf of education. What we're specifically asking for is for school boards to have the authority right now. And they did change, you're right, they did change that a few years ago to allow county councils. They added educational purposes to the impact fee statute so that county councils could levy them on behalf of schools. And that was a positive step in the right direction. I think that was something that you all benefited from for sure. But it needs to go further. It needs to be something that it says that the Fort Mill district on its own can levy impact fees without having to go through county council.
And again, certainly we would be for that. There are some other challenges with the way the language is written today. We are having some differences of opinion with county council, and so getting
Right.
it cleared up would be
Imagine that.
Yeah, because of the criteria that's in that law also is very cumbersome.
Well, I think that's something, Christy, that you all can help us with as we move
Well,
forward on this.
that's really my offer, is that we can help with how I think some of the specific things that would be beneficial to change in the way the law is written.
That would be great. That would be great. And you all know more than most districts, having gone through this and having legal challenges to it. So absolutely would love for you to offer that input. Absolutely. Okay, so is there anyone else like to make any under well, I've got a question here. What is this? Is there a question? No? Okay. Okay, so is there anything anybody would like to say in regards to these top issues? I think it's good to talk about these. I think for those of you who participated in the regional meetings, you're finally getting to hear what actually rose to the top. I will tell you there was one other issue that was at the top as well. But, in terms of the ranking, in terms of number of votes, you couldn't say that they were within they weren't 1, 2, or 3, or 4. But that was the issue of allowing school boards to opt in on the state health insurance. And of course, we sent out a survey. Many of you participated in that survey as well. But that one also is in there. And I think there are some boards that are going to be working come 2022 on that issue as well. But those are the top issues, again, that we would like for us to begin advocating for. Scott actually met with the Senate leader last week or a couple of weeks ago and kind of talked about this. So there's already some conversation taking place with some of the leadership in the House and in the Senate. So I'll look forward to that. All right, so let's move on to legislation that we know is going to be debated. We know is going to be kind of front and center in 2022. And let me just say too that they've announced, I think, in the House that House members can begin pre-filing bills for 2022, and that's going to take place, gosh, in the next several weeks. It's like towards the end of November. So I'll get you those dates out to you, emailed to you, but they're going to begin filing legislation. And as Scott mentioned, this is an election year. You're going to see all kinds of bills. Unfortunately, because it's election year, there's going to be a lot of crazy bill that is going to be filed. And I know for some of you school board members who like to look at those pre-files, it never fails. I get panic calls from several of you asking about this bill. And I would just tell you, again, it's an election year. Some of these bills are filed, doesn't mean they're going to go anywhere, doesn't mean they're going to get a hearing, but I just kind of wanted to give you that word of caution.
Yeah, and I would just like to echo that because, with the changing of the leaves and other things that we see where fall rolls around, we start to see the filing of the pre-filed bills. And what that means is that the news cycle is going to go crazy. Because every crazy bill that gets filed, and there will be a lot of them because it is an election year, you're going to get calls about it. But just stop, take a breath. And if you have questions about a bill before you respond, call us. We'll be glad to talk to you about that, because Debbie's right. Bills get filed for all sorts of reasons. And a legislator may file a bill with no intention of moving that bill forward, but he or she wants to be able to tell their constituents, yes, I put a bill in there. I couldn't get it to go anywhere this year. So just know that it's scary. And if you're looking for a nice thriller to read, sit down and read through the pre-files at night with a glass of cocoa or something stronger. And it's going to be interesting, but they will be out there, and don't overreact to them. Don't be alarmed by them. If you have questions, give us a call. We're glad to help you with that, because you will get calls.
Debbie, I've got a question. It says, can you please expand on or explain this bullet in the handout? Under local laws, only one school district may levy impact fees, and other districts' local law regarding impact fees is in litigation.
Sure. Okay. Well, we know that Fort Mill has may levy impact fees. There's another school district that had the ability to levy fees, but it is tied up in litigation from our understanding. So it's, again, that's local legislation. That is not statewide law. That is something specific to one or two school districts. So I don't know, is that, I guess if please let me know if I'm answering, if that makes sense and I've answered the question. Okay. If I didn't, just let me know. All right. All right. So I can also tell you that in 2022, and we kind of gave you heads up back in the summertime, we're likely to see some discussion, and I don't know what the legislation may look like, but I do know that there's going to be some reports that are due to the General Assembly regarding how the COVID-19 funding for school districts, the ARP money, the American Rescue Plan money, the CARES Act money, how those dollars are being spent in local districts. You know, the General Assembly spoke a lot about this issue because, you know, we've had millions of dollars come to South Carolina specifically allocated to K-12 and to local school districts. And so lawmakers are watching that very carefully. They want to know how that money is being spent. You know, it becomes an issue too when they start developing the budget, which begins right away in the House. As soon as they open that session in 2022, the House begins to work on developing that budget. And certainly this issue is going to be coming up in discussions during those subcommittee and committee meetings. So we need to be prepared to discuss how districts are using that. And as school board members, the heads up that we've really been trying to give you is you need to be aware of that. You need to know how your districts are using those funds, whether or not they've been spent. And so just be prepared to talk with your lawmakers about that. I would recommend, actually, if you're holding meetings with your local legislative delegation between now and the start of the session, which we also encourage you to do. We would love for all boards to do that every year before they come back, to have a conversation and to talk about the 4 issues. Use that as an opportunity to start pushing these issues that we just went over, and then also to talk about this next issue that we know will be in the House and be up for debate, likely on the floor fairly early in the session. So, you know, you should begin talking about, use that opportunity to talk about your ESSER funds, your CARES Act funds, and how those monies are being spent. And to also please remind them that this is one-time money. This is not money that's going to be given to you all the time. So if they are thinking about funding reform, for example, or, you know, studying that, just keep that in mind. This is not money that is recurring. This is money that is one time, and how those dollars are being spent as one-time dollars. So just a couple of points that I want you to, if you're talking to your lawmakers, make sure that you point out. So there are several issues, I would say, that are going to be front and center in the legislature, but one that we know for sure is House Bill 3976. Now, this is a bill that would establish the Education Scholarship Accounts program in the state. It is basically public dollars, and public, to be more specific, funding for public school dollars that would be provided to eligible students to attend private schools and to pay for expenses for private schools. So it's not just tuition, it is a list of eligible expenses that are outlined in this bill that they could be used to attend. It is not for, interestingly enough, it is not for students who attend public schools. And someone said, well, why would you want public school? Well, because if you wanted to go to another district that, for example, that charges, that it's not called tuition, but it's the difference in taxes or whatever. It's your out of district tuition or out of district fee, if you will. That's something, I don't know, that could be in there. But interestingly enough, too, in that bill, if you read it, one of the eligible expenses is to pay for a class that you might take at a public school, which is interesting because I don't know how you would decide how much a class costs, but I mean, I guess there's probably some way to do that. That's not outlined in the bill. Or you can pay for a service, a fee for a service that is provided by your local public school district. Again, service isn't defined, but that is an eligible expense. But that is the only expense that's eligible under this bill in terms of public school. It specifically states in the bill as well, just that you must, the parent has to sign, that I'm going to do this and that, this, and one of them is that I will not enroll my child in a full-time in a public school. So it is specifically for private school and for private school expenses. And the other key point here that is different than, say, the tuition tax credit program that we currently operate in our state, the funding that they will use to pay for this program is the allocation for every student that leaves a public school and attends a private school. The funding for that child to put in this account will come from their resident school district. So in the bill, the state treasurer is directed to get the money from the money that's allocated, public state funds that's out, and it's just your state funding. I do want to point that out. It's not your local or federal. The state funds that are allocated to the school districts will then be used to be put into a statewide fund that administers the program. So it is direct public school funding. It is not funding from the state general fund that pays, for example, for the tuition tax credit. That's in the state general fund. This is actually allocated from your districts. It's taken away from your districts. Now, the question that I have is the amount that's allocated to each student is a state average of state funding for students. We know in our state that there are some districts that are below that average. In other words, they have a higher local tax base, so they don't get as much state funding. What's not addressed or answered in this bill is, how is that done? If you're not allocated the average amount of state funding, then how can you take that amount away? You would be taking away local dollars. So there's still some questions regarding that as well. So I hope that makes sense. I know that was a lot on you, but it is direct school funding. Again, that's the key difference in this one. It does take school funding from public school districts if the child resides in your school district. The other question that has come up in my mind reading this bill is, what if this child is a resident in your school district, but then moves to another district? I don't know if that funding then continues to be taken. It should not be continued to be taken from that resident district. But again, that bill doesn't speak to that. So that's a question that we have. So if you get a chance, it is a fairly large bill, I will say, because you can see from the handout that if you, I kind of summarized the bill, but it's fairly lengthy. But I wanted you to, have a good idea of what was in that bill. But if you go in there and read that, you'll see that probably will bring even more questions that come to your mind about that. But there are several questions in there that are not answered. But again, the problematic thing here is that it is EFA dollars, EIA dollars that's allocated to your districts that's used to fund this. All right, so also unique to this is that this program will not be administered by the State Department of Education, or that the Department of Education will be involved in any way. This program will be solely administered by cabinet agency, the Department of Administration, which is really a gubernatorial agency under the governor, and then the Education Oversight Committee, which is a legislative committee. So the funding and the administration of setting up these education scholarship accounts, that's done by the Department of Administration. The eligible expenses or the eligible fees or things like that, or the eligible private schools, those will all be approved by the Education Oversight Committee. So that is also something unique to this bill that is different than, say, in the tuition tax credit program. It does set eligibility requirements in terms of students who are eligible, the private schools that would be eligible, or the services that would be eligible, and qualifying expenses also. Now, I will say with the qualifying expenses, they're somewhat broad. There's a whole list of things that you could use as expenses. For example, a computer would be an eligible expense as well. So anything that your child would need to attend the private school, transportation also. But basically, the way that this works is that once you're eligible, if you apply and your child becomes eligible, and as it has been admitted to a private school, a fund is established, kind of like a bank account, if you will. A government fund is established, or an account. And in most states that have these programs, parents are provided with kind of like a debit card. And so the debit card then is used to pay those expenses out of that account. So that's hence education scholarship accounts. So this bill was filed on February of this year. It received a hearing after much pressure by the groups that are advocating for this bill to pass. It received a hearing late in the session. I think that hearing was either in May or April or May of I keep saying last year, but we're in the current year, last session. And, they heard testimony for and against. The Ways and Means Committee, had members talked about it. But the key thing that happened in that meeting was that Chairman Merle Smith announced that while they've got to look at several things in that bill, I think there's a concern about the cost of implementing this program, that this bill will likely pass, more than likely pass the committee, be placed on the floor, and will be debated. And when you have a bill that has more than 60 sponsors signed on, then it's likely to pass. It's likely to pass the House. I mean, wouldn't you agree, Scott? Yes, he would. So we know that now, whether it has to be sent to the
Not
Senate.
only that, I was told it will pass the House. So
Yeah, it probably will.
that doesn't mean we don't make noise and fight against it. We've done that every year when we've been told that, and we've been successful so far. So we're taking this very seriously, and we'll push against this in the House from the first steps, from the first subcommittee hearings, all the way through to the final House vote, and then we'll push it in the Senate too.
And I think the key point as you're talking to lawmakers about this is the fiscal impact. I mean, that's going to be the key. This program is going to cost money. I tell you, there have been previous scholarship accounts, bills that have been filed, and the sticking point has always been the cost of this program. And in your handout, actually on page 4, even though there is no fiscal impact statement yet on this bill, if you look at past similar bills, this has been, fiscal impacts have said that, there's a phase in, and by the 3rd year of the program, it would cost the state as much as $500 $500 million, $450 million. But that once it becomes wide open and everyone is eligible in the state, there's just no end to it. So I would
Debbie, we have a
certainly talk
question.
about that. Yes.
We have a question here. Somebody wants to know, will there be any requirements of the private school to receive the funds, i.e. accreditation, academic requirements, any accountability measures?
Though, again, those, yes, there will be, but that's going to be determined by, again, the Education Oversight Committee.
But it won't be the same accountability measures that apply to
No,
public.
no.
Okay. Yeah.
No, it will not be the same accountability measures. There's no, not at all. But that's a good question. And that would be a question I would ask your lawmakers as well, and point that out. Okay. All right. Are there any other questions? Any other comments anybody would like to make? I wanted to try to finish a little early to allow for that. I guess I would ask you all who are viewing this that I'd like to hear from you. I mean, I'd like to hear from you. Are you hearing from your lawmakers any legislation that might be filed, any new legislation that you're hearing that might be filed, or, so we'd like to hear from you. Maybe you can put it in that chat, put it in the chat box there. And then also the other question I would ask you is, while we shared the top 4 issues that arose from our regional meetings, if you didn't attend those meetings, but you have ideas about what issues are important that you believe to be important, we'd like to hear that as well. I mean, if you wanted to type that in the chat box, we would greatly welcome that, and we'd like to see that as well. So we greatly value your input. We greatly value your support. And so we just really want to hear from you. And I'm glad that we're going into this session advocating for something, not just fighting against something, that we need to be pushing for those things. And I think we have some leverage. As I said in the regional meetings, I think we have some leverage now. I mean, if we're, we need to use this new law that, has sets a high bar for school boards that, again, no other elected board in the state has. We need to use that. And we need to say, to our lawmakers, you supported this. So if you support this, then we need this to not have our hands tied, or whatever it might be. So to make it a level playing field, if you will, to give us the things that we need to do the right things, training, not tying our hands with funding, those kinds of things. So I think we need to start talking about that together as a team, as your association, and as you as individual board members, or as, collective boards, to begin talking about that. We need to be fighting for those things that are important to you. And let's move past this and let's get those things that you need. That's my cheerleading. There's a cheerleader that's come out of me. I hope you can feel it.
Well, and I would just like to echo that too, because it's going to be an interesting year. There are a lot of things that are coming down the pike, heading toward us as we speak. And, you have but to look at national headlines to know what's coming our way. So it's so very important that your legislators come to Columbia with a complete knowledge of education issues in your districts. They may not agree with them, but nobody can then say, well, we didn't know. We didn't know how this was going to impact us at the local level. And they do pay attention to that. So I would strongly encourage, as Debbie said, please have conversations with your delegation members. Many of you do legislative briefings at your school board meetings. Gosh, I would say no legislator ever turns away the opportunity to be in front of a microphone. So I would say it's a good opportunity to invite them to come to your school board meeting and give you a briefing. They will be very willing to, most of them will be very willing to do that, or invite them to a legislative breakfast. So it's about making sure you have that relationship, and it's about making sure that nobody can come to Columbia and say, well, I didn't hear from my board about something, or I didn't know they were upset about this because I never heard from them about that. So I would, and that's something that we can help you with. We can help you with advocacy. We have an advocacy toolkit that's available that we'd love for you all to download and look at from our website. And many of you do this, and it's a wonderful thing. And we need to do this statewide, because we've got to make our voices heard. I don't think we were heard enough last year, and the bus rolled over us. And I think we need to make sure that we are making our voices heard legislatively. So I want to, Debbie, thank you for that very detailed briefing. And we did have one question. Has House Bill 3976 been tried in other states,
Yes.
like Florida or places like
Yes.
that?
Yes, if you look on page 4 of your handout, there are several states. It's 6 states actually have enacted some sort of an education. Most of these other programs are called education savings accounts. That's the other thing that's a little bit different. This bill is called education scholarship accounts. Most of the other states, they're called education savings accounts. They all operate the same way, again, with a government bank account, if you will, with a debit card and expenses. I will tell you that most of these, they're very, very limited, because again, these are very costly programs to states. So Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, Nevada, actually Nevada, if you'll see a note there, Nevada passed legislation to allow one, but they actually have not implemented. Theirs was actually litigation stopped that program. And so they also changed over their General Assembly, and they have a General Assembly that is not favorable to an education savings account. So they haven't gone back to make those changes that the court cited as being problematic, and that's why they've stopped that program. But that law still exists on their books. But that, and let me just say too, speaking of that our South Carolina's bill is modeled after the Nevada legislation, which is very wide open bill. So most of the bills, like even in Arizona, Florida, they're very limited. Like the only students that have special needs are eligible, or there's a cap of how much they're going to spend. You know, the state sets a cap, so it limits the number of students who can participate, because there's a cap of how much they're going to spend. So most of them are, again, very limited, but there are those programs. And again, on page 4, you can read a little bit more about that. Good question. Appreciate it.
Okay. I think we're winding up here. And again, thank you, Debbie and Natalie and Becky for helping put this together. And thank you, our membership, for your participation today. And we hope that you have found this webinar to be helpful in preparing for the 2022 session, which is right around the corner and will be here before we know it. A couple of housekeeping details to pass along that before we end. Board members who registered for this webinar will receive Boardmanship Institute credit. The webinar has been recorded and will be available on the SCSBA website, hopefully soon. Finally, we look forward to seeing everybody at our upcoming Legislative Advocacy Conference, which will be December 4 and 5 at the Marriott in Charleston. During the conference, we will hold our annual delegate assembly to elect officers, vote on our association's legislative platform, and we'll have a few constitutional changes to look at this year too for your approval. Again, I want to thank you for participating and taking time out in your lunch hour on this beautiful day to join us. And with that, have a wonderful afternoon.